The 90s, they're back, right? I say that as a woman who has been clinging onto her skinny, high-waisted jeans for as long as I possibly could. I've only just succumbed to the baggy jean trend. But while we might be happy to see baggy jeans making a comeback, not everything from the 90s and the 2000s sits so comfortably. Sophie Gilbert is a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist and the author of Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture turned a generation of girls against themselves, a book the New York Times have called a course correction. She's taken a closer look at how that era quietly taught us to shrink, compete, and perform, all under that shiny banner of quote-unquote empowerment. Today, I know you are going to find this episode so helpful. We are looking back at the stories we grew up with, the ones that still shape how we see ourselves and each other, whether we realize it or not, and re-examining where some of these stories have come from in a helpful reframe. Because I was just talking to Sophie before we started recording, and I think it's a tricky time because we blame a lot of things looking back at that time on ourselves, but there's a lot else at play, which we're going to talk about. So I know this is going to be helpful for you and how to work through that too. Sophie, obviously looking at the book, it's obvious why you revisited this time because there was a lot going on. But as I just said, we kind of look back on this time as quite nostalgic. Why did you want to revisit that time? And what do you hope that we notice this time around?
I know there's so much nostalgia and I understand it too. Like I've been telling people when I hear the opening bars of Thong Song, it just takes me back to 1999.
You cannot beat a bit of Cisco, yeah.
No, I mean, it's such a banger. There's so much from that era that was just, it's so tied up with our memories of kind of fun and self-discovery and joy and also some of the music obviously is just incredible on its merits.
Agree.
But also, I mean, we've sort of been in this period of revisiting so much culture from the 90s. I mean, rethinking about people like Monica Lewinsky and Tonya Harding. And then I have always been interested in women in culture. That's sort of very much my beat at The Atlantic. And after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, it seemed like this moment when the progress that I had taken for granted for women throughout my life was not inevitable. And actually things could regress. We could lose our rights. We could lose the power that we'd kind of scrapped and clawed for. And I wanted to know why. I wanted to know why sort of more people weren't rioting in the streets, why it was this thing that was just happening to us. And there were a lot of people who were passing the politics of the moment and what had happened. And it just seemed to me, being a cultural critic, that so much of the culture of the 90s and 2000s was worth a revisit, and particularly with regard to the ways in which it had shaped millennial women, had shaped our dreams, our identities, our sense of self, the ways in which we relate to and respect each other. And so I dove back into the culture and tried to see if I could make any of it make sense.
It's really fascinating to look back at it because we do kind of idolize some of the pop culture moments from that time. You know, we think about Britney and, you know, Spice Girls, and it holds a special place in our heart. But just how powerful is pop culture when it comes to how we see ourselves and each other? Because we can dismiss it really as something that's just, you know, not news, or it's something that's just light to pass the time. But how powerful is pop culture?
It's incredibly powerful. It's unbelievably influential. And I think a lot of the times it's influential because people don't take it seriously, even the people who are watching it. Like I know that women, for example, love reality television. And reality television is something that has never really been taken seriously by any kind of critic. I think in academia, there are some people who are analyzing it and doing really good work, trying to sort of understand the messages that it disseminates to us. But it's incredibly influential. And in some ways, the things that we don't talk about, things like reality TV or porn or influences on social media, perhaps, those are the things that are sort of sneaking into the corners of our brain. And so to me, they seem so much more worth unpacking for all those reasons, to try and understand what makes them so popular, how they appeal to us, and why they sort of set off those little ping pong sensors in our brain, if that makes sense.
It's really interesting. You can learn a lot about it, and particularly reality TV. I've heard you talking before about that kind of intersectionality, you know, where people fall into multiple groups of marginalized people, and the fact that we kind of sort people into those groups depending on what kind of reality TV you're allowed to be in, right?
Yeah, I think in the earliest days of reality television, there was very much a segregation in terms of who was allowed to be on what kind of shows. So if you were white, for example, you could go on The Bachelor and you could compete for this kind of grand love story and this very like idealized Disney romance and win a diamond and get a husband. But if you were a woman of color, you were much more likely to end up on a show like Flavor of Love on VH1, where, you know, women who appeared on those shows almost immediately were sort of dehumanized. Their names were taken away. Flavor Flav would give them these like new identities. And it was very jokey, and it was just quite a lot crueler now, I think, looking back, than it seemed at the time. And the segregation also of it was really shocking and really, really distinctive.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you look back at things that you know, took just as, you know, pop cultural singing, you know, like 50 Cent's PIMP and as you said, you know, Britney Spears dancing as a schoolgirl. It's just, you know, you look back at it and think, oh, I just thought that was part of the time. You said that you treat this like a history book full of stories that we weren't told at the time. Is there a specific pop culture example you can share that you feel like kind of epitomizes how some of the things that we saw at the time differ to what we look back on now and what was actually going on?
Yeah, one I keep coming back to is the movie American Beauty, which came out in 1999. And it was very lauded. It was this very sort of aesthetically gorgeous movie with, you remember, the rose petals and the plastic bag. It was seen as this real incredible artwork. And watching it now, I think I just see that it is a movie about a middle-aged man's sexual fixation on a teenage girl, on his teenage daughter's best friend. And the movie, and also I would add too, he has a sort of very annoying wife who's very careerist and ambitious, and he seems constantly frustrated by her because she's annoying him in different ways. But that's less troubling than I think to me, the spectacle of the teenage girl played by Mini Savari, who really, I think the movie defends as a figure of lust. She's sort of dressed up in rose petals and she appears in these fabulous dance sequences. And it was a movie that won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, and no one at the time seemed to be troubled by the dynamics of power between Kevin Spacey. Obviously, things have since come out about Kevin Spacey too, so it's possibly not the best movie for a rewatch for lots of reasons. But just the fact that it was accepted so broadly, I think, not just by cinema but by culture at large as something anodyne is really worth. It's interesting to me now, because I think there was so much of this sexualization of teenagers in the 90s that really led up to Britney Spears in her school uniform in 1999, aged, I think, 16, 17 at the time. This moment that I think for a lot of us really changed pop music forever.
And you talk about this fact that kind of especially through the 90s, a little bit into the 2010s, that kind of the only power that women were allowed was sexual power. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this kind of reframed everything for me. I was like, oh, you know, when you haven't looked at something in that way, the penny dropped for me. And what was driving that?
Yeah, I mean, I start the book again in 1999, and I look at a couple of things that happened that year. And one was Britney on the cover of Rolling Stone in a pink and black bra holding a Teletubby doll. In this like fabulous David LaChapelle photograph, but it's very strange to look back on now. But it did seem to be this moment, and I think I was a year younger than Britney at the time, in which girls my age were being told that the one form of power that we could have, the most thrilling form of power that we could embody, would be sexual power. And it was everywhere you saw. There was a Abercrombie & Fitch catalogue that came out at the end of the year in 1999 that I think was targeting 13 to 18-year-olds, and it was very sexualized. It had an interview with the porn star Jenna Jameson, but it also had this interview with the actor Lily Sobieski, who had just, I think, been in Eyes Wide Shut. And it refers to her as a Lolita, and, you know, how she's sort of a bad girl. And it has all this language now that I think just sets all my alarm bells ringing. But there was this idea, I think, in media that for girls, we were sort of able to be sexualized. It was a normal thing that was happening, and it was something that we ourselves should enjoy and should seek, because it was something that would signal that we were sort of coming into our power, or that we were, I don't know, desirable in all the right ways.
It's really very interesting looking back. You talk and you say that the recent history of technology is written on women's bodies. What do you mean by that?
Well, it was just really fascinating to me to see how many of the tech platforms that we use today and that we really take for granted, like they're huge parts of the infrastructure of our online lives, how many of them were started because the people involved wanted to see essentially boobies online. Like, I think it's just...
You talk about how videotapes basically took off because of the porn industry.
Yeah, I didn't realize this until I started working on the book, but the year that VHS tapes were launched, 75% of them are pornographic. Like, there's always a thread of early adoption with any new form of tech that's about watching sex. And so I sort of have my sweet memories of going to Blockbuster and like renting, cartoons on VHS.
Shattered.
But really, it was a hotbed of smut from the beginning. No. But things like Facebook was launched because Mark Zuckerberg wanted a way to rate the relative hotness of Harvard undergraduates who he was at college with. YouTube was launched because some of the programmers involved were looking for a video of Janet Jackson's nipple reveal during the Super Bowl show, which became known as Nipplegate. And they couldn't find a video of it online, so they decided there was a business opportunity. Google Images was launched that day. Remember when Jennifer Lopez wore the green, very low-cut dress to the Grammy Awards? It was gorgeous, like Versace dress. I think it had a jungle print, absolutely stunning. But so many people the next day were searching for pictures of that dress and of her wearing that dress that they had to start a whole new, basically, infrastructure for imagery online, which became Google Images. So all these critical parts of our tech, I think, come from the same impulse, which is like the impulse to look at pictures of gorgeous women. And once you see that, it's hard to look at anything else on the internet really in quite the same way.
Oh, yes. So it's so true. And so you trace a lot of the toxic messaging back to porn and its influence on culture. How did that shape how women were taught to value themselves and how they relate to each other?
This was the really critical part of the book for me, because it wasn't initially intended to be a book that was so much about porn. I really had this question in mind, which was, why were women so easily persuaded to think so little of themselves during this era, to think that all we were was sex objects and that was the one thing that mattered, and to think so little of other women too, to be so cruel to each other online, to see something like Britney shaving her head as a form of entertainment rather than a woman's profound mental health crisis at being stalked by paparazzi. So that was the real thing I wanted to figure out. And the more I looked into it, the more porn seemed to have influenced really everything in pop culture in a really profound and striking way. And I think it makes sense now, because there was such a proliferation, such a huge rise in the number of people watching porn, but it really from the 1990s onwards, even before the internet. As I said, VHS was this incredibly popular medium for watching porn at home. But then the internet came along and suddenly it just revolutionized sex. Like, anyone could watch it in their home, not quite in their pocket, because we didn't have iPhones yet. But and of course, that filtered out into culture in different ways. It filtered into fashion. I'm sure you remember sort of the late dresses of the 90s, where people were kind of wearing, I'm trying to think of the word to describe it, like cobwebs, really, rather than dresses. But there was this huge,
remember that.
There was this huge trend, I think, for very exposed skin that you could see later on the red carpet, and people like Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan were wearing these very minimalist dresses. This is not to shame any of that. This is just to say that a lot of the trends seem to be coming from this moment of porno chic in culture that was felt, I think, so much in music as well and in movies. Snoop Dogg, for 2 years in a row, had the top selling hardcore explicit pornographic DVD.
This is wild.
I should say he did not perform in it. I'm not sure if anyone will be relieved or disappointed to hear that. He did not. He was kind of like a rolling MC, but he was introducing snippets of the videos himself. And then in 2003, Snoop Dogg showed up at the VMAs, I think, in New York with 2 women on leashes wearing, they had dog collars around their neck, and he had both leashes, one in each hand. And it just seemed to be this moment that really crystallized the dynamics of power, how women were kind of being made figures of fun, but also belittled in this very dehumanizing way. And it was all about male dominance and male power and male celebration. So much of that seemed to have been absorbed from porn and from this medium that is very much about privileging male gratification and male desire.
Totally. When you look at, how women saw themselves in that time and how they've taken that self-image on and how we often relate to each other, it is very obvious that we are viewing ourselves through a patriarchal lens. And, this term being crumb maidens, who can be there to mop up the crumbs because that's the only way patriarchy will value you and let you be in the club, right? And so you also track this kind of rise of more extreme porn because there was so much porn available on the telly. It kind of ramped up and kind of put a flame under it, right? And intensified the porn, and that further intensified these kind of parallels that were playing out in society, right?
Yeah, that was something that was really interesting to me too, because I hadn't fully put it together in my head. But basically, as you said, the more pornified different kinds of culture became, the more there were shows like HBO's Real Sex and in England, like Eurotrash on the telly. There was basically, the more you could see really sexually explicit imagery in fashion magazines and in art galleries, the more porn had to distinguish itself to stand out so that it could get people to keep paying for it. And so you do see in the 90s in the late 90s and the 2000s especially, this real tend towards extremity in porn, towards more cruelty, more violence, a lot more callous treatment of women especially, this very sort of intentional but also discernible shift in terms of what kind of porn was being made and popularized. And that, of course, in turn then bled out into the culture as well. So you see movies like Hostel, which debuted, I think, in 2005, which was very graphically violent in an almost sexualized kind of way. And this real interrogation of different kinds of power in other kinds of culture and in movies especially.
Yeah, and that one, people criticised Hostel when it was made because obviously it showed a woman being abused. But then when the makers were criticised, they said, "Oh, but she fought back." So, it's really about empowerment, and that is one of the themes that you've seen throughout this word is this word empowerment. And you said that it kind of sets off alarm bells in your head now when you hear that word, which was kind of surprised me. But why is that?
Well, anytime the word empowerment came up in my research, it was being used to defend something that someone had complained about for one reason or another. So, for example, the Wonder Bra, when it was launched in 1994, and you had those bombshell ads with Eva Herzigova and that apparently caused car crashes or something. They were a very big deal. But there was criticism from not just from feminists, but from other people. And the people at Wonder Bra claimed that they were empowering, that it was empowering for Eva Herzigova to be portrayed this way, which of course maybe it was. I'm just not convinced that buying a Wonder Bra is a path towards empowerment. And this word, it just kept coming up. Whenever someone had been critiqued for doing something, they would turn around and they would reframe the argument and they would say, actually, this is empowering, so you have no valid right to critique it. And it just became clearer and clearer to me that anything that was being defended as empowering was never actually about giving women power. It was about selling women this very narrow, very reductive, very tailored towards male gratification ideal of themselves. Lipstick, I'm sure, has been defended as empowering. Like, we've seen a rise recently in the number of women who sell corsets to other women. I think they have different names now. They're called waist trainers. But, it's always these very sort of old-fashioned, historically frowned upon things that are revived and sold to us as things that will empower us. And very rarely, I would say, do they actually do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of can see the threads to how this, and we've hinted at it, but how this time kind of trained us to see ourselves as sexual objects and to, it's degrading. How did it train us to see other women?
So There's a chapter in the book in which I really deal with the year 2007, which was pivotal for me for lots of reasons, but also I think in culture, it was the moment when all these trends in 2000s media kind of collided in this very ugly way. So it was the year that the celebrity sort of industrial paparazzi machine really hit its peak in Hollywood. And you had women who were just being hounded by photographers in the middle of horrific personal breakdowns. I mean, 2007, I think February, Britney shaved her head. Anna Nicole Smith overdosed on painkillers, and her body, I think, was filmed being wheeled out of the hotel room where she died onto an ambulance. And there's footage available, not of her, but like she's in a body bag, but still it's this moment of profound like loss of dignity. It was the year in which Paris Hilton went to jail and then was taken out of jail and then was returned to jail sobbing. It was the year that Lindsay Lohan went to rehab, Nicole Richie went to jail and got pregnant. I mean, it was just this parade of women really failing at the project of celebrity, but also just not being able to cope, I think, with the conditions that they were living under. But it was also the year that Hillary Clinton ran for president for the first time, or announced that she was running for president. And so I think what interested me in revisiting it was really considering my own thinking, like in this moment when women were constantly breaking down, they were in crisis, they were like really struggling, I think, with what was being demanded of them. Like, what did that condition us to think about a woman who was asking us all to trust her with power, with significant power, with the most powerful role in the entire world? Like, what did this sort of spectacle of a female breakdown tell to us about what women were capable of? And I think certainly my own thinking, possibly in like the subliminal passages of my mind, there was a lot that was not generous to women in this moment because of the culture that I was consuming all day, every day.
It's very, very interesting when we look back at that. I kind of knew a lot of the Britney stuff because I made a podcast series, documentary series about Britney and what led to the conservatorship. And I know 2007 was so pivotal. And when you read about the things that were going on there, for Britney specifically, it was absolutely unbelievable that this was happening. But I did not realize that Anna Nicole Smith and Nicole Richie, I hadn't even connected to the dots that 2007 was so pivotal. And of course, that was the year that Facebook was created as well. So it really was this real ramping up and this inflection point for pop culture.
Yeah. And there was this real shift for women, I think, that happened in the 2000s with regard to celebrity. Because before the 2000s, I would say, if you wanted to be famous, typically you had to be good at something. You had to be an actor or a singer or an artist or a writer, or like you had to have some kind of skill that was leveraged towards celebrity. But with the dawning of reality TV and with the early days of the internet, suddenly you didn't really need to be good at anything anymore. You could just be visible. And the more visible you were, the more you showed up on red carpets, or the more you let photographers take your picture, or the more you sort of broadcast aspects of your own life online, the more famous you could become. And it was this real, I think, shift in terms of the deal of celebrity in so many ways. And then obviously Facebook and later Instagram came along, and they very much exacerbated this dynamic that was already happening. But in so many ways, I think what happened in the 2000s was we all learned to turn ourselves into objects and to imagine ourselves being, as objects through the camera's lens, and to think about ourselves as people who could be photographed and to really like turn ourselves into content in lots of ways. I'm not saying that all women did that, but for me, certainly, like it was this impulse that I think began in this moment of like Facebook photographs and later with Instagram.
You talk about, which I think is very revealing around how we were thinking about other women at that time, is kind of the rhetoric or the conversation around women who did want this life and who did put themselves out as celebrity, a la Paris and Nicole. They were very intentional with what they were doing. The defense was, well, you wanted it, right?
Yeah, it was really, there was so much cruelty expressed towards these women because I think precisely for that idea, because we all understood that these were the terms of the deal that they'd made. Paris Hilton, I think, starred in a movie called House of Wax in 2005, a very bad remake of a B-movie horror. I think I watched it at the time, I'm sure. At one point, she gets killed in the movie. It's this very sexualized end. She gets stabbed in the head, like impaled in the head with a spear. But to promote the movie, the producers put up posters all over Hollywood saying, "See Paris die." Like, it was just this real like acceptance, I think, that we all hated these women and even like wanted terrible things to happen to them. This idea being propagated and Paris Hilton, to her credit, like seemed fine with that. Like, she seemed okay with accepting those terms. But so much of the language, when for example Britney started to really have crises with her own mental health, like, so much of the language was just really dehumanizing. It was really cruel. With Amy Winehouse in particular, when she was being photographed, often in states of disarray, there was so much disgust in the ways in which bloggers would write about her, as if she were just like really repulsive, and there was no sympathy. There was no sympathy at all for the fact that this was a woman who was struggling with addiction, and a woman with really profound talent. It was just this like very superficial, very scathing analysis of how these women were failing because they weren't beautiful enough, or they weren't being sexy enough, or they weren't composed enough. They were sort of falling apart. And even while people were turning that entertainment, they were critiquing them for it.
So true. For that series that I talked about, I interviewed Perez Hilton. And so I did a lot of research into the specific things he said about, I was just trying to pull it up then, but I can't find the questions that I asked him, because I actually read him all the things that he said about Britney. I think he was taken aback by it, because I'll have to double check this, but I'm pretty sure he said that he wished she deserved to die, multiple things. And it was kind of this ramping up. But again, his kind of storytelling was driven by this technology, because he was one of the first bloggers. So it's really interesting when you see this happening in so many different pockets, and everything is tying into everything and kind of fueling this frenzy.
Yeah. Perez Hilton, I think when Heath Ledger died, he sold T-shirts that said, "Why couldn't it be Britney?" It was was it. But it wasn't just him. It was also, there was a story I found in New York Magazine written by an art critic who decided to review Britney's, I want to say meltdown, but it's such a gendered word, but her crises, I guess. He reviewed them as if they were performance art. And it was just this very striking, like, really
uncomfortable,
cynical kind of analysis that was rooted in like perfect acceptance of the idea that she might die, and that everyone was waiting for her to die, and that it was inevitable. And there was no sympathy for this woman who was 25, who by that point had 2 sons. It was just sort of very, very degrading in ways that I think are really striking, but also helpful to look back at now, because they help us understand so much more about what we were all dealing with at the time in living in this culture.
Absolutely. And when you do start to look back at this and what you were doing at the time and what you wanted and how you related to other people, that you do really start to connect the dots. It's quite profound. How do you see, if any, differences in the way women are now portrayed in pop culture compared to this time in the late 90s, early 2000s?
I see so many differences. I mean, there's a lot.
Thank God.
Yeah, to end on a high note. No, I mean, there's a lot, obviously, that's still really troubling. The manosphere I think, has turned this really egregious form of outrageous sexism into comedy in lots of ways, like into entertainment. But in terms of the mainstream popular culture, and especially the culture that women watch, things are so much better. I mean, during the 2000s, I really struggled to find examples of movies even that had 2 women talking to each other in scenes that were not where they weren't talking about men. Like, women just were not in movies in the 2000s, or if they were in bikinis, or they were like on a stripper pole, or they were someone's annoying wife, or someone's annoying girlfriend, or some killjoy scold who was ruining all the fun, or they were jokes. They were figures of comedy often too. But it's so different now. I mean, I was thinking about the Golden Globes earlier this year, and you had all these women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, like standing up, being honored for really interesting, really difficult and challenging roles. You had obviously Demi Moore in The Substance, but also things like Night Bitch, which is about the transition into motherhood, which, I cannot imagine anyone making a movie about that up until this point.
No way.
No.
That was not in pop culture. That's why this last year has been an absolute slap in the face for me, because
it really is.
Everything that you know about, I mean, you're going to start me off on one, and we've got limited time, but everything we know about motherhood and the transition to motherhood has been in hushed tones and in short snippets of conversation, because you don't want to be a downer and you don't want to be boring and you don't want to bang on about it, and you wanted this, right? Like you can see how all of this is playing into how we view ourselves now. 100%. Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
No. I mean, it happened to me too. I had twins in New York during COVID.
Oh my gosh.
In this moment where I was obviously disconnected from all of my family, couldn't see my friends, my husband's family were isolating. So it was really just me and my husband and the twins. And I went through this profound identity crisis, because suddenly all the things that you've ever drawn your sense of self from go away, and you have to kind of think about who you actually are, like what you actually value. And it's this period very much of like emergency where you just survive. But then you hopefully come out of it and you have to start thinking about putting yourself back together again. And so this was another big part of the book for me, because I realized in that moment how much of myself had been drawn from culture in lots of different ways, some good, some bad. But no, I mean, there's such a wide variety of different kinds of stories about women's lives, and it's culture is so much more inclusive now. There's just more women being given opportunities to make art, and that to me is the really hopeful thing for the future, because having looked back through this book, obviously at all the ways in which art defined our imagination and defined who we thought we were and what we thought we were capable of, there's so much being made now that is just completely in the opposite direction. And that does make me think that as bad as things might be now, in the next 10 years, we could be in a completely different place.
Yeah, I can't imagine somebody like Taylor Swift being around in those early 2000s or 1990s. And so it just occurs to me, not to take a backward step, because we're really heading to somewhere lovely, but did you in your research think about the relationship between technology, how women see themselves, how women were taught to relate themselves, and how now dating has moved? Because I think a lot of these, it kind of is like this petri dish of where all of the most profound things happen, right? I think for me, dating, obviously I'm not dating because I've been with my husband for a very long time, but you know, it just strikes me that all these things are feeding into so many different areas of our lives, but one of the most profound has to be if you're dating now. Right?
No, absolutely. No, I have been married for 16 years, so dating is not a huge part of my imagination. But I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago who's in her 30s, and she had been dating men of different ages, men in their 20s, men in their 40s. And she said she cannot communicate what a difference there is between men in their 20s and men in their 40s. The ones who were the last kind of generation to grow up without complete saturation in a kind of porny internet, and then the ones who have grown up with this very extreme content being often normalized and just being a normal part of the backdrop of masculinity. She said it's just really, really striking to observe, and that I think is troubling. But I think it also does make the conversations that we're able to have about porn's influence on culture and also its influence on us so much more important, and for everyone to have, I don't know, just this sort of an awareness of all the different ways in which it might have shaped not just the culture, but our own lives.
Yeah, I know, because that was kind of where we started, you know, how much difference can pop culture really make? But when you start connecting the dots, it's that thing, isn't it? You can't unsee it. You just can't.
Yeah. But that, I mean, my real hope with this book was it's part of a much larger project of people revisiting the era, like you with your Britney analysis. And there are so many incredible podcasts and writers and movies and people who themselves were victimized during this era who are going back to revisit things. And my hope was just that in piecing together as much of this history as I could, everyone would be able to see it through a different frame and a different lens and take different pieces away from it and extrapolate them and see things that even I couldn't. So it really is, I think, part of a much larger process that does make me hopeful.
And obviously you've taken the deep dive here, but for us living everyday lives, what can we do to be more conscious of what we're absorbing and believing? Are there questions that you now ask yourself when you consume media or when you look at things and you have an instant reaction? Are you a bit more careful about how considered you are when you're watching and viewing things?
I mean, I think I definitely have. It's not that I'm careful. I just have this little alarm bell now that goes like ding, 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 ding. So I was trying to watch the movie LA Confidential the other day with my husband, which is this great classic, right, that I'd never seen. And it's just all these men. And then there's like Kim Basinger in a dress being very, 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 very sexy, but also not really having any personality and not really having any agenda beyond the fact that she's like this sex object for all the men in the movie. And I'm just like, I just can't.
Come on.
I can't. And not to ruin culture. I'm sure there are plenty of people who love that movie for lots of the right reasons. But for me, at this time in my life, it's not for me. And that's not to say that anything has to be ruined. The thing I think I try to do, there's a lot on beauty culture in the book and on diet culture. And the thing I have tried to do recently, especially as I've been on book tour, like obviously presenting a more public face, is just to be less critical of myself, to sort of question the critical voice that comes up whenever I'm finding dissatisfaction with something about the way that I look. I'm realizing now that I'm saying this to you at 7 a.m. when I haven't brushed my hair. So it's a very, it's an interesting visage with which to say all this, but like I've really absorbed these lessons, but I've just been trying to sort of call that voice out in my head a bit more and to understand that it doesn't actually come from me. It comes from these lessons that I internalized a long, long time ago. And if I keep calling it out, hopefully at some point it will go away.
Yeah, it definitely will. Because I think that as you repeat those things to yourself, or, the way we relate to other women, often we say things about ourselves that are negative, and we, trying to, make ourselves more likable, or that nobody, I don't think I'm all that kind of thing. I think the more that we clock where those voices are actually coming from and why we feel we have to interact in those ways with ourselves and each other, the easier it is to break those patterns, because it feels like you're saying somebody else's words then when you realize where they're coming from. It makes it a lot easier. And obviously that is the struggle that we all have, and it's on the daily. But I really like that. Thank you so much, Sophie. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for reading the book and for having such thoughtful questions. It's been a really, really great conversation.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. We've just flown through it. There is so much more in the book, and this time is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. We've heard a lot about Brittany of late, and that conversation is ongoing. But to take another look back at kind of the broader picture and what was going on at that time, I do think it's really helpful to kind of consider the way that you relate to yourself and other people. It's a big deal to go back and look at this. And I think it's going to unpack a lot of those either unhelpful behaviors or unhelpful thoughts that you have. And you can kind of give yourself some grace and stop feeling guilty about it, because a lot of this is not in your power. It's not in your family's power. It's not to do with the way that you were raised personally. It's to do with what was going on with society. So I think it's incredibly helpful to go back and look. So make sure you check out Sophie's book. She, as I said, is a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist and the author of Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Girls Against Themselves. Make sure you check that out in the show notes. It is fascinating and a bloody good read, so check it out. I am so grateful to you for joining me. If you are enjoying the podcast so far, you know what I want you to do. Get on there and leave me a review, you lovely people. I absolutely love reading them, so I'll be so grateful to you to add to that little stack that I keep going back through when I have those little doubts and little voices in my head, and go and read your lovely things. So thank you. I'm so grateful to you. I'm Ed Stott. I sincerely hope that's helpful.